counsel at Quinn Emanuel, and I'm the president of APABA-DC. APABA-DC is the Asian Pacific American Bar Association of the Greater Washington, D.C. region. This panel is organized by APABA-DC, and it's sponsored by NAACP, our national organization, and also Wiley and Quinn Emanuel. So thank you to our sponsors, and thank you to all of you for attending. We've got a really great lineup of speakers. You can see on the screen Chiraag, Johnathan, Roscoe, and Sean. And between them, they've worked at the local, state, and national level. They've worked at in all three branches, and each of them have a ton to contribute to this conversation. You all have their detailed bios, so I'd prefer to just jump right in, and you'll hear about their work during our conversation. So I think we can just start. I want to start the conversation by situating ourselves in this moment in time. We're living in the middle of a pandemic, and then we see footage, really graphic footage of the murders of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery, and the harassment of Christian Cooper in Central Park. These types of incidents have long happened, but it does seem that there was something about those videos and how they made the experience for the viewer that provoked grief and outrage, as well as a realization among the non-Black community about the everyday brutality that Black Americans face. I want to start by throwing it to Roscoe. I know you talk a lot about history in your criminal justice classes at Harvard and the University of Michigan. I was hoping you could maybe spend a few minutes contextualizing this moment in history and situate us within the historical context.
John, thank you so much for the opportunity. It's great to be part of this panel. And first of all, I want to thank APABA, both the DC and national chapter, for this opportunity. Look, I think this question of where we are right now in terms of historical context is really a question of whose lives matter. And that is a question, I think, that has really gone back for African Americans really since the dawn of us entering this country, right? If we think about this moment as simply about policing, then I think that we missed the broader context in a larger conversation. Clearly, it's about policing. It is about accountability. It's about transparency. But it's also a question of human dignity, right? Because when you think about really the opposite of criminality, it's really one of humanization. And when you think of the larger context of the African American experience in this country, it has been one where their lives have literally been at risk. Whether you go back to slavery and the enslavement of African Americans in this country, going back to 1555 and the Florida experience, 1619 and the Virginia experience, all up to thinking about the Jubilee moment of when African Americans escaped slavery and then went into a period of lynchings, where literally we know now, I think there was a report that came down last week by the Equal Justice Institute, that over 6,000 African Americans were lynched in this country, really from the dawn of freedom and Jubilee of end of slavery, all the way up until the World War I era. And then you had Jim Crow that came about, and you had African Americans treated as second-class citizens. And then now you've entered a period of mass incarceration, in which one of its tentacles is this notion of policing. But in a nation that literally has 5% of the world's population, we have 25% of the world's prison population. In the land of the free, we incarcerate more people than any other place on earth. People who were born in my lifetime, an African American who was born in 1978, has a 1 in 3 chance of being in the criminal justice system. They have a chance of 3 times the amount of chances as a white person of experiencing police brutality. So when you look at the long trajectory of really the American experience, in some ways this is not unique. But what is unique has really been the fact that we've caught these incidents on camera, right? Which has, I think, exploited and really shown to the American public really what is going on in communities of color across the country. And let me just also say on that point, there's a long history of African Americans telling of their experiences through different mediums. During the slavery, it was through slave narratives. During lynchings, it was actually pictures of lynchings that were happening. And now we're seeing, through the advent of cell phones, we're now being able to see what's captured for the mainstream, what African American communities have experienced for so long, or really these egregious acts of misconduct that oftentimes are not, they go unpunished. Look, let me just say, police have a very tough job in America, and they do, majority of them do an excellent job. So this is not about bashing policing, but what it is about is thinking about issues of how do we have accountability, how do we have transparency, and how do we really bring and restore humanity back into this experience? And if I could just end on this piece, I would just end by saying, look, I think that we are at a unique moment. Whether it will be a defining moment or a passing moment will be up to us. But I hope that this moment will be for the current generation with the Emmett Till moment. Emmett Till, a 14-year-old who was brutally murdered in Money, Mississippi, who was lynched. Really, the showing of his body, his tortured body, really helped to spur and launch the modern day civil rights movement of the 1960s. I hope that George Floyd's death, watching for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, someone get brutally murdered as crowds of protesters scream out, "He can't breathe, stop doing that." It takes less time to put someone in space than it did for the amount of time that somebody had his knee on his neck. And the indifference of the face of the officer. I hope that this will be a turning point where the consciousness, not just of Americans, but we're seeing people all over the world. We're seeing protests in London and Berlin, really an awakening about what type of democracy do we want to have.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. And Sean, you work at you're the president of the local chapter of the NAACP in Fairfax. So you're seeing this at a very local level. How is this moment any different from what you're seeing than, you've been involved in the struggle for racial justice for a long time. What are your views on this particular moment in time?
Yeah, and let me just start by saying thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. I do believe this is different in a lot of ways. So I'd like to make the context local a lot of times because that's the environment I work in with or at least volunteer in as the Fairfax president of the NAACP. After the George Floyd incident, we had a rally where we had around 2,500 residents join us, people who never had been involved in social justice, racial justice, or anything of that nature. And our police chief joined us as well. And, he said things like this don't happen in our county. It's sort of this narrative that we're immune from that sort of thing. And and this was about maybe a week after George Floyd's murder. And not 3 days later, we had an officer here in Fairfax County come on the scene of a man who was in mental distress, wasn't a threat to anyone, and tased him immediately, turned him over, put his knee on his neck, and kept tasing him as the guy screamed that he couldn't breathe. 3 days after this rally where the police chief said this didn't happen. And I knew that when the chief said that was untrue because I had seen the data where in Fairfax County, which is for those who may be from viewing from elsewhere, a suburb of the DC area, very large, over 1 million people here, also very affluent. We have maybe 9% of our county is Black. But if you look at the use of force incidents, nearly 50% of the use of force is against Black people. So this huge disproportionality that we see now, I think it's about the 5th or 6th year of that data showing that same trend. And so this was going on and people had nothing to say. This was almost seen as, well, these things happen. Now, for the first time, we are seeing people not only engaging in this movement, but demanding to know why are our police doing this? Why is this sort of disproportionality here in Fairfax County? This is also a county that's in Virginia, the former home of the Confederacy. And we had a Robert E. Lee High School that we were, protesting for a long time for them to take down. And they slow walked that for about a year now. Within a month, they are going to rename that school. It has been voted on and it will be renamed before they open it up in the fall of this year. So these are changes and this is attention that should have been paid, that could have happened, and now it's happening. So to me, I do see that this moment has changed things and has changed it pretty rapidly. But I agree with Roscoe, whether it is a moment or something that is passing or something that is redefining, it's really going to be up to us and whether we keep the attention and keep the pressure on it.
Yeah, definitely. And I should note we've got three veterans of the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice, and Chiraag is one of them, also Johnathan and Roscoe. And Chiraag was there during the outrage that happened after Ferguson and helped write the Ferguson report. And Chiraag, I'd be interested to know, obviously the event Ferguson propelled change there, or propelled at least, your report. But how do you see this moment? Do you see a different kind of a policy window that has opened after the murder of George Floyd? How do you see this in comparison with Ferguson?
Sorry, Don, just getting my technology right. Okay. Yeah, right. So Ferguson, Mike Brown was shot and killed by Darren Wilson in August of 2014. And 2014, I would say to 2015 or 16 was the last period of intense activity, movement energy, people on the streets, the public paying attention in a way that is similar but different from the current moment. And I'll just note parenthetically, well, what happened after that? Donald Trump got elected, and we all, I think, started spending a lot more time reading his tweets than paying attention to these harms and these murders. But the movement kept going, right? The movement kept building, organizing. We're making moves. We're building their bases. We're developing new strategies. And I think what we're seeing right now is that coming to fruition, right? Because these videos aren't actually new. There is something particularly egregious and I think revealing about the George Floyd video. So I do want to echo what Roscoe said about 8 minutes and 46 seconds, just watching someone slowly be murdered on video while other people are saying, get off him, and he's calling for his mother. Obviously it's a very painful video, an example of, racial trauma and collective mourning, I think, coming out of that. But it's not just that, right? We've seen awful videos, the Laquan McDonald video. There are just so many videos that we've seen. What we have in this moment is a few different crises kind of coming together at once. One is the pandemic that we've all experienced. People in particular, and Black and brown people, have been experiencing much worse than everybody else, right? Disproportionately getting ill with COVID, disproportionately dying of COVID. And that's a result of, I think, a combination of underlying disparities that are the product of racism, as well as continuing racism, inability to get tested, inability to get service when you go to a hospital, right? There's that. There's the COVID crisis that we're in. There's the heightened environment of racial antagonism that I think is just objectively observable in the case under this presidency. Donald Trump, I'm not a supporter of Donald Trump, but I think it's hard to understand the issues. I mean, I have to, so you know where I'm coming from, but I don't think you can have this conversation seriously without talking about the racial antagonism that he has put out, trying to divide Americans by race and race baiting through his campaign and currently through the presidency as well. And then these videos hit, and the movement was in a place that was strong enough to be ready for it and to react to it, to capitalize in this moment in the sense of really bringing a public awakening that I think we've really got to credit that to them. So how is this movement different? How is this moment different in terms of productivity? I think it could be also. One of the things I think about a lot with Ferguson is there was this collective paying attention, rapt attention for several days and weeks, and then it sort of trailed off as the months went on. But the wins that were generated were not many on policing. We're seeing more movement right now. Congress has a bill that's pending, introduced by the Democrats, the Justice and Policing Act, and it is not what the people who are leading the movement in the streets want, but it is much more progressive, far beyond anything that has been presented as the Democratic position, and something that will likely pass the House. So I think that's pretty remarkable. We're seeing local wins. Communities are talking about, defund the police. What does that mean? Maybe we should cut the police budget. You're seeing serious proposals to cut $1 billion out of a $6 billion budget in New York City, cut $150 million out of the LA police budget, and more. Many communities are severing ties with the police in terms of their involvement in schools. I think all the evidence shows that police don't help in schools. It's not an evidence-based reform, but it's one we've invested in significantly. The greatest consequence of having police in schools has been to criminalize Black and brown youth and kind of fuel the school to prison pipeline. And I think we can actually have that conversation in a way today that it wasn't taken seriously before because of the movement work that has been done. And there's more details to get into on all of that, but I think this is a moment of possibility, and the question is, how do we translate this into greater power building and then a governing moment where these, whether that's now or in a future time, where more of these changes can actually show up in policy, that is in law and in local policy as well.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Chiraag. And we actually do have somebody in government at this moment on the panel. So Johnathan is the Deputy Secretary for Civil Rights and Workforce in Governor Cuomo's office in New York. He's also the interim commissioner for New York State Division of Human Rights. And so, Johnathan, you're uniquely positioned to talk about this moment, this sort of policy moment or policy window to actually make changes. So I'm hoping you can talk a little bit both about the experience of New York and the experience of being on the inside and having this, experiencing this moment from the inside.
Well, thank you, Dawn. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you to APABA for having me. And, you know, it is, I think, really great in this discussion to also include the discussion of what's happening on the state and local level. You know, as was mentioned, you know, I worked with Chiraag at the Department of Justice in the prior administration, and obviously the federal government has a really important role to play in this discussion. But you know, we often, you know, I think forget that so much of the government that affects our day-to-day lives is not the federal government; it's our state and local government, as Sean was talking about before, and you know, for all of the challenges that may exist on the federal level in this current moment, you know, there is also an opportunity to think about how do we engage policymakers and politicians and elected officials at all levels around really important and overdue conversations around race, around criminal justice reform, around making sure that we have a government that works for everyone. You know, in New York, although obviously the events involving George Floyd did not take place here, certainly in New York, we have been no stranger to issues of tensions between law enforcement and communities of color. We've had our own similar tragic incidents, whether it's Eric Garner or other individuals. You know, there's been issues discussed nationally about the use of stop and frisk by the NYPD. Certainly there were issues about excessive force by various agencies within New York State in response to the George Floyd murder. And, you know, one thing to Chiraag's point that I think was really powerful was that, you know, there's been all these long-standing conversations and efforts to make legislative reform around policing, around law enforcement accountability, and those efforts often were not able to kind of make it across the finish line. And I do think what has been different this time, at least here in New York, is that the organizing, the energy, the passion, the demand for justice and accountability has led already in New York to tangible reforms. A few weeks, 2 weeks ago or so, the governor signed a range of bills that will codify long-standing reform efforts. One of the biggest changes is a change to the access that the public has to law enforcement disciplinary records, a statute known as 50A in the parlance that, you know, has been a rallying cry for advocates for a long time to have greater information and accountability and just knowledge about the activity of law enforcement personnel. And for many years that legislation was not able to get done. And it's 100% due to this moment and to the demands for accountability that we now have that law 50A has been repealed, and there's now greater transparency and access for those records. At the same time, the governor's also signed legislation that codifies an executive order that he had signed 5 years ago that establishes a special office in our Office of the Attorney General that will prosecute or investigate and prosecute cases involving law enforcement violence towards communities, which again, that already had been the law through executive order, but having that codified in statute means that regardless of what happens to this governor, that's now a part of New York State law and policy. We also, one of the other things that the governor signed as part of this reform effort was another executive order that mandates local law enforcement agencies and municipalities all across New York State to actually have those tough conversations with all stakeholders, including community members, about how do we actually reimagine and reinvent law enforcement. We have over 500 police department law enforcement agencies in our state of varying size and complexity. Like, it's not just New York City, obviously. And so, really making sure that over the next several months, the momentum that we see right now gets translated into really difficult but necessary conversations about how to make sure that we are considering the voices and the roles of community and having overdue conversations around the diversity and makeup of our law enforcement agencies, the use of different techniques and strategies, the use of discipline, how we think about accountability in law enforcement agencies. And so this moment is really different. And one of the things that, I think is really important that shouldn't be lost is that for all the attention rightfully on what Congress is doing, on what the president's doing, on what the Department of Justice is or is not doing, there's also a real opportunity to make sure that we are having those same conversations and holding all of our elected officials accountable and making sure that where policing happens the most in our local communities, that we're actually holding those officials to task for what the role they have played or not played around these really important issues.
Thank you. And it sounds like all of you are optimistic, and that gives me a lot of hope. But I also am cognizant of history in that we've had moments of progress in the past. We've had Reconstruction, we've had the Civil Rights movement, but then we often have a backlash. And I'm wondering, do you feel like this moment is different in that sense? Do you expect a backlash? What are the types of reforms do you think are actually possible given this moment? I'd be interested. I'm going to throw it open to anybody to answer. But I'd be interested in knowing, what you think in terms of this moment compared to the civil rights movement and Reconstruction, and whether we'll see that kind of backlash.
Well, some could already. This is Roscoe. I think I'll jump in. Look, some could already argue that we've already been in the backlash, right? The same way that you really had President Johnson's really response to after President Lincoln and kind of really the rolling back of Reconstruction policies under the so-called radical Republicans that really helped to really move us from being a republic to a democracy with the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, and also the origination of so many civil rights laws. Someone could make the comparison, right, that you going from the nation's first African-American president, all the progress that was made on a wide variety of issues, you could make the argument that we may be in a backlash already. Look, I think the most important piece, though, here is to also to think about, particularly as civil rights lawyers, that all of us are here, is to also think that, when you're talking about civil rights policy, it oftentimes has been evolutionary, right? Sometimes I think people want as much change as possible, but when you look through a political system, oftentimes it is a piecemeal endeavor. The example that I would give is when you look at the history of civil rights laws in this country. We had a Civil Rights Act of 1957, a Civil Rights of 1960, a Civil Rights Act of 1964, a Voting Rights Act of 65, Fair Housing Act of 68, ADA of 1991, right? So the point is, or 1990, the point is we didn't get everything that we wanted in 1957, right? It's oftentimes an evolutionary process. And when you compare that to where we are in criminal justice reform right now, you can make the argument we're already in an evolutionary state. You go back, you look at the late 2000s where the Sentencing Reform Commission started to really change some of its sentencing guidelines. In 2010, Congress came back with its reform of crack powder cocaine. You saw the passage of the Second Chance Act last year. You saw the passage of the First Step Act in 2018. You could already argue that we're already in an evolutionary stage, and policing reform is the next vehicle of that.
Yeah, I would agree with Roscoe to what he was saying. I would say 100%. We're already in the backlash, right? We're already seeing this and seeing the ramifications of that. And I think this may be the backlash to the backlash, right? Where people are responding back to that. But I also, when I think about this in the context of the civil rights movement and everything else, there's two things that come to mind. With the different periods where we saw people fighting for rights, they were fighting for declaring that I am a person, I have dignity. You have the famous line, "I am a man," right? It's interesting to me to be in these protests and on the streets and seeing white silence is violence, and sort of a point, not so much I am a person, that you sort of establish that, but pointing to you are a part of the problem. You are complicit in this problem, and you need to address that. I think also we all here, work with policy, and we get focused on that, and that's sort of the keys to change in a lot of ways. But I think there is a cultural element to this that I'm seeing, especially in organizations, where they're like, we need to adapt anti-racist behavior. We're seeing people, I work with the Fairfax and NAACP. I received calls in the same day from the Girl Scouts of America and the Atheists of America in the same day, right? So they're all calling me about the same thing of how can we be anti-racist? How can we change our culture? So I think we're seeing a couple of different things happening outside the policy space where people are being more introspective in what is in my role in this systemic racism? If it is systemic racism, what is my part in that system? And I don't know if that same sort of reflection and introspection happened in previous civil rights eras. It was more people declaring and trying to fight for codified changes. But then this is something, at least to me, feels unusual and different.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Don, can I add on to that? Oh, go ahead, Chiraag.
I just wanted to share, I share the optimism of that this may be a moment to do more, but I want to share some sobering facts too. I saw a poll out recently. If I had the technical skills to share this, I would do it because I'm looking at it. I've got the URL. But I'll just have to read it to you. The question is, what's your reaction to George Floyd news and to the George Floyd news? And the overall numbers are 41% of the people who answered this 2,000 person poll expressed general outrage over the killing of George Floyd. 41%. The numbers are slightly higher for people who identify as Democrats and slightly lower for people who identify as Republicans. The next highest category of reaction was 23%. People responded with calls for order amid protest. So their responses were things like, it's sad that people have forgotten how to protest peacefully. And then 17% blamed both sides in protests, which is I feel familiar by this point. There are certain categories. 12% say respond with calls for justice for George Floyd and for the Black community, and a mere 3% call for changes for society. The kinds of comments that go to systemic racism and real structural change. So that tells me actually there's a lot of work to be done, and there's a real danger that we will express collective outrage in this moment and not translate that outrage into meaningful structural change, so that we won't see more George Floyds, more Breonna Taylors, more cases where it's somebody didn't have any business having the police respond to them at all, let alone kill them. Mm-hmm. And so I'm very worried about this. I am optimistic. I think that there's a lot of energy right now. I want to really co-sign what Sean was saying about the kinds of messages and the kinds of people who are showing up and putting themselves out there. I think this is an opportunity. What we need to do is extend this moment and not have it pass. If it passes, these numbers that I just read, that'll be translated into meaningful change. If we extend this moment, continue to demand structural change, there's a shot that these numbers will rise and people will realize that tinkering is not actually going to give us a different system. They're starting to use the right words, but that hasn't translated yet into broader policy demands for the general public.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
When I work with Senator Booker, oh, go ahead, Johnathan.
No, very quickly. I think I would add. I agree. I think a lot of what with what Chiraag just said, that in some ways we don't know what this moment is yet going to be because we're still very much in the middle of it. And one thing that I think is important, and to like the history that Roscoe laid out, is that any conversation about racial change or really deep societal change in our country has never happened in a vacuum. And so going back to I think the really beginning of this conversation, like it can't be lost on the fact that we're not just having this conversation about race, we're having it in the context of an unprecedented pandemic, of unprecedented unemployment, with a real kind of reckoning about our healthcare system. And so, I think in many ways, I think that all the risks and opportunities that I think Chiraag mentioned are really there. But I think the challenge, and I think where we've seen transformation for good or bad, I think throughout the history of the very fraught history of race in our country has very much been about how that conversation has connected to larger kind of challenges and issues that we've been facing as a society. And I think very much, I think you see this playing out in the dialogue around public health, around public safety, around racial justice. Very much it's about which narrative are we going to accept and what type of country do we think we are and should be. And I think in many ways, that's a question that I don't think as a society we've answered. And in fact, if you look at the different ways in which different communities and different states have responded to the multitude of crises before us, I think it's very much an open question about what narrative, if any narrative, will actually be the one that determines, what steps we take going forward as a country writ large.
Look, I'll just also add, when I used to work with Senator Booker, he had a saying that said, change doesn't come from Washington, change comes to Washington, right? The power of social movements has always been the power to move from protest to politics, right? To move from getting the attention of the nation, raising the consciousness of the nation, and then taking those things and formulating them into policy changes that will change the lives of people in a nation of 300 million people. And I'm optimistic that can happen. Look, we haven't seen these type of demonstrations of energy, how long they have gone on, the mass numbers, cities across America and across the world, and policymakers responding at the state level, at the local level, at the federal level. And even I've seen in different countries that they're also looking at their own criminal justice systems. And so I think it's also a tribute to the long African-American freedom struggle that has consistently raised the consciousness of this country about making sure that the promises of our values are promises that actually have teeth and are part of the reality of the American experience. But I also wanted to say, I think to Sean's point, we're also having a larger conversation that's bigger than just policing. And part of it, too, is also about ideology. It's not lost on me that you're seeing the reckoning with these Confederate statues and monuments throughout the country, right? A civil war that was fought over 160 years ago is still being reconciled as we have these symbols of white supremacy all throughout our country. Look, when the southern states left the Union, they were very clear in their secession documents about why they were leaving, not just also because of slavery, but also the doctrine of white supremacy. And the flip side of that, and the history that I told, has really been one of this long history of treating African Americans not just as inferior and second-class citizens, but also this presumption of criminality, right? That supported, the rationale of Jim Crow segregation. When you go back and you look at the Supreme Court decision, it was about public safety, right? It was this notion of African Americans as being criminals. When you look at Birth of a Nation, a film that was, one president said it was like writing history with a lightning bolt, right? This very racist film that was incredibly popular in America that led to the second advent of the Ku Klux Klan. It was wholly about this notion of Black criminality. And I think that has spurred and fueled the system of mass incarceration, where we went from 300,000 people behind bars to really the most of the 20th century, into the law and order movement in the 1970s, where we went from 300,000 to 2.3 billion people behind bars. I think now America's reconciling that and dealing with a struggle of ideology as well as a struggle about all these particular policy issues.
Yeah, certainly, and I, there's one has to remember also the history of, after slavery, white landowners were deputized to, to return. Well, there were lots of laws requiring during slavery whites to bring slaves back to their or their enslaved people to their quote unquote owners. And then after that, the anti sort of unemployment laws and things. I know that Roscoe can speak a lot more intelligently about than I can. So there's a long history of sort of white supremacy in policing itself. We've
And if I could just mention on that point right there, I think one thing that's lost is that people assume we've gone from slavery to Jim Crow, or from slavery to Reconstruction to Jim Crow, right. And that misses a very important period of criminal justice, and that was really convict leasing. I'm from the state of Mississippi and Texas and Louisiana. All three of those states, their state prison systems used to be former plantations, because you had a time period in America, really about from 1870 up until about World War I, where African Americans through the Black codes of Reconstruction were arrested on these trumped up charges, and they weren't put in prison cells. They were put back on the very plantations that they left. They were leased to private companies, and those companies were slave plantations. So for generations of Americans, African Americans in particular, their experience of slavery de facto lasted much longer than the Civil War. And it was the criminal justice system and the loophole in the 13th Amendment that really allowed that to go on for so long.
Mm-hmm. So I'm curious to know, in terms of this moment, and all four of you work in criminal justice reform, what kinds of changes do you think are actually possible? And we hear the cries of defund the police. We also hear activists talking about moving law enforcement to more of a public safety or social services provision of government services. And there's of course a question about this from our one of our attendees. I'm wondering, do you think that this can become a reality? What kinds of changes do you think are actually possible, or what kind of changes do you want to see? Because obviously, I think as Johnathan says, we are in the middle of the moment. So, we ourselves have, and you certainly all working in criminal justice, have the potential to move policy in the direction that you want it to go. But what do you want to see, and what do you think can actually happen?
Well, I've been talking about personally a list of different things that really are rooted in accountability and transparency. But one of the things I've been calling for, and this was mentioned earlier, was removing the cops from schools, right? Removing the SROs from the school system, because that does contribute so much to putting people in that system and keeping them and perpetuating that. And I've been surprised that, local officials, state officials, they've been very accepting of that. There's a moment of not only possibility, but I think people being open to hearing things that normally they would be against. And I saw the question from the audience. When I talk about this, I don't necessarily talk about defund the police, whereas when I look into the spirit of that, it's much of the same thing. But I talk about reimagining public safety, right? We talk about policing, and it presumes that we need a police system. Whereas really, a lot of these times, we're really talking about public safety and what does that look like in the school system? What does that look like in your community? It shouldn't always be that every issue you have, a man with a gun responds, right? And so we've been looking, at least locally, within the last week or so, at a model they have out of, I think it's Portland, Oregon, where they have sort of triaging their 911 calls and who responds to that, having sort of a non-armed emergency response system. So this is something that I don't think I would even have been able to have a conversation about a month and a half ago. Mm-hmm. And this is something that our chair of our public safety is endorsing, our state officials are endorsing. So I think there is a real momentum for change. And I think it starts with the understanding that not everyone's lived experience and is the same with the police, and that what makes us all safe is not always the same for every individual. And how do we reshape our society to do that?
Yeah, I'd like to add on to that. I agree with Sean's points, and I'll just add a couple of more specifics. I think the audience might be interested in some of these things, and we can pick them up in questions. I think on the accountability, I also focused on accountability. I think there are some specific things that people can fight for right now, both locally and federally. One is, criminal accountability. Now, a lot of parts of the criminal justice, criminal legal system reform movement don't focus on criminal accountability because they think that plays into the nature of the problem, which is that we turn to incarceration and criminal convictions too much. I'm sympathetic to that. I also think that this form of accountability, given the system we have, individuals and families that you matter. And so this is important to me. I used to prosecute police misconduct for the Justice Department. One of the things that was very hard to do was to prove that the officer in question had the requisite level of intent to convict them of a federal crime. And to get really nerdy here, because I think there's a lot of lawyers on the line here, the statute that the Justice Department uses to federally prosecute police officers, prison officials, and others who abuse their government authority is a Reconstruction era statute. It's 18 U.S.C. 252. It requires that if the officer is depriving you of your rights, your right to be free from excessive force, that conduct be willful. We have to prove that the officer willfully deprived someone of their rights under color of law. Willful is the highest standard of intent in federal law. It's not reckless, it's not negligence. It is very close to first-degree premeditated murder. It means that the officer knew what they were doing was wrong and chose to do it anyway. In the case of a situation like Breonna Taylor or Philando Castile, Tamir Rice, the 12-year-old boy who was shot and killed when the officer rolled up on him, jumped out of the car, and right up next to him, gun, and acted by shooting him within seconds. Those cases are essentially impossible to prosecute under the willful standard, and the federal government has to play a role here because the federal government is independent of local police. They don't work with local police in the way that local prosecutors do on a day-to-day basis. There's something that can be done to fix that, amending the federal statute to lower that to recklessness. I'm going to offer here to the audience that this should be one of your demands. If you are engaging with members of Congress, if you are opining on anything publicly, if you want to write letters, ask that standard be lowered so that these cases are actually prosecutable. Reckless violations of people's rights should be prosecutable. It is at the state level. It should be federally as well. Another thing I would say to put on your list is end qualified immunity. Qualified immunity is a judge-made doctrine that is, some 40 years old roughly, that we didn't have for the first 100 years of Section 1983. Section 1983 is the statute that allows you to sue over official misconduct, including police brutality. And qualified immunity says if there wasn't a case where the kind of conduct you experienced was deemed to be a constitutional violation by a judge, in a court of law before, and you typically need a written opinion to figure that out, then then it's not clearly established and the officer can't be liable for it. In fact, you can't actually sue the officer and the case will be dismissed on that basis. We should say qualified immunity has no business in American law. It's not based in text, it's not based in original understanding, and people should ask that it be removed. There are some other specific things like that I think we can suggest. The other thing I want to say, though, is to the point of it's not just policy, it's also power. So all of this comes down to who has power and how do you exercise power in your community. And there I want to highlight two quick things. One is budgets, which Sean highlighted. So I think this defund the police conversation is actually very important. Whether you want to abolish police or not, whether you want to cut funding or not, what's critical about this conversation is that it gets to, we put resources where our values are. We put resources in the mechanisms we believe will actually bring about public safety and stability in people's lives. And so putting resources in a non-law enforcement first responder corps, as Sean described, that Portland has and that his community is interested in, is a statement, right? And it's expression of values and of power, and it may well bring about public safety. So I think we do need to focus on what does this look like, what do we spend our scarce resources on? And then I think there's a connection to voting here, Dawn, and perhaps I'll say that because I've been speaking for a little while, but I just want to say, coming up in an election, the criminal justice system has been used to disenfranchise people. Felony disenfranchisement is rooted in political power from Black people. It is metastasized to cover a lot more people, and it inhibits the expression of the public will because people can't go vote. I think that we should do away with that, and of course, do everything we can to open up the voting process so that people can have their voices heard and translate that into policy outcomes.
Certainly, and besides, I was just going to say, even besides felony disenfranchisement in the voting context, then we have voter ID laws, which is something that I've worked on, and and I know that other panelists can talk on other things as well. But obviously, when we're talking about these issues, it's not just. Right now we're really focused on policing, and it is very important because of the violence that the Black community has had to suffer for so long. But when we're talking about systemic racism, obviously it permeates everything. I think Roscoe or I heard somebody wanting to jump in.
I think Johnathan has a point, and I'll jump in with a point. Go ahead, Johnathan.
Oh, thanks, Roscoe. The only thing I was going to add, very quickly is that, I do think that, and I think builds off of Chiraag's last point, I think there is and should be a conversation about specific policy prescriptions that we think are appropriate, whether the ones that he described, the use of chokeholds, some of the issues that are also a part of the federal legislation, the use of law enforcement in schools, what have you. But I also think too, I think part of what, at least for me, struck me or continues to strike me about these protests and many other, kind of similar protests is, at the core, I think what a lot of people were really frustrated about was the fact that they don't believe that their government works for them, certainly in the context of criminal justice, but in other contexts as well. And, I think that is a deeper and more systematic problem, and it goes to, some of these larger challenges that, have confronted us as a society. But, one of the things that was really, I think, noteworthy about some of the landmark civil rights legislation that was mentioned previously is that they made lots of policy prescriptions, but they also fundamentally changed the way that we think about kind of what is the agreement we have between society and, in the case of communities of color or other kind of historically marginalized or vulnerable populations. And, one of the things that would make me very happy to come out of this moment is an opportunity not just to, discuss these policy prescriptions, but also, kind of step back and discuss, are there just ways in which how we create our criminal justice system, our economic justice system, our education system, are there ways in which that's just not working for far too many people in this country? And what I think really sets, not to say that any of those bills or statutes are perfect, but what they do is they challenge the fundamental system that we have in place and whether or not it's actually fair and equitable. And I do think part of what, if we really want to be responsive to the concerns, no one's saying, simply end a specific police practice, as much as they're saying, I want my government to see me and to recognize me and to acknowledge me in a full way that I deserve. And I think if we demand anything less from our governments, and I say this as a government official currently, I think we are letting them off the hook, because I think there's really an opportunity in this moment to have a larger, broader conversation and to really use what we're seeing to do that. I think, again, we had a very similar moment a few years ago with Me Too. Like, I think we're seeing this in an array of contexts, and these are interconnected issues, as many of these things often are. But I think really the opportunity here is to think about what's broken about our system and how do we fix it in a real and meaningful way.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll just say, if I could just jump in just really quickly, I think, a couple of points, I think, to this larger conversation. Look, there's a conversation that goes on in the academy all the time about, is our criminal justice system really broken, or is it actually working as it's intended? In other words, is it just the next form of racial subordination and control that African Americans have experienced? And when you look at the gross disparities upon the African community, you look at the fact that we normally think of the movement from Brown v. Board of Education, where we are now, is really an act of progress. But for many communities, the very things that people have marched and bled and died for can literally be taken away from you once you commit a criminal offense, including the right to vote. And I'll just say, as voting disenfranchisement came up, I mean, if you ask most Americans, would they support the existence of a Jim Crow law in modern day society, most people would be like, hell no, right? Well, we actually do. I mean, felony disenfranchisement laws were part of the same disenfranchising conventions in southern states that created literacy tests and poll taxes. They also had disenfranchising laws. And so we still have Jim Crow laws on the books. In fact, the Congress, the legislatures that passed the felony disenfranchisement laws were not only do they have a disparate impact on minorities, but they were crystal clear in their intentions. In Virginia, for example, if you stole chicken feed in the 19th century, you would lose the right to vote. And the whole point of putting that out there was they wanted African Americans not to participate in the political process. And so that's another piece that I think we should be thinking about. And then lastly, I'll just say to Chiraag's point about 242 prosecutions, look, that's incredibly important. And not only, and I'll say this as a former federal prosecutor, not only is it really about the victims themselves having some type of affirmance, that's incredibly important. But these criminal prosecutions are also important because they can lead to cultural changes. When you look at the statistics right now, when officers are trained, they spend about 40 hours of their training on use of force policies. They only spend 10 hours on communication and de-escalation. And so part of the thought here is that by bringing these 242 prosecutions, which by the way, right now the standard is so high, you only see about 43 prosecutions broad average in a year in the last decade. But if you're able to bring more of these, you're also going to see culture changes in police departments, moving away from a shoot first philosophy to one that's going to be held more accountable, and also think more about their interactions with citizens. It's not being one with combatants, but also one with people that you protect and serve, and communication and de-escalation is a major piece of that.
Just really quickly, if I can, what Roscoe's saying, I think is so fundamental, when we consider whether the system is broken or operating as it's intended to act. We've talked about, the importance of convict leasing and incarceration. A lot of this was designed to impact African Americans. We talk about the modern day policing and the slave patrols. These are all systems institutions that we designed to be racist, and now we see that disproportionality in current day, and we sort of scratch our heads. It's like, well, yes, these were designed that way. So now if we don't no longer value those things, how do we change them?
Yeah, and I'll just say too, I think irregardless of the answer to that question, whether it's broken or working as intended, we have a trust gap between communities of color and law enforcement. And I'll say this as someone who's a federal prosecutor, as law enforcement, you don't want a trust gap, because you want the community to be able to come to you and tell you about crimes, to be witnesses in prosecutions. And so, having a trust gap actually undermines law enforcement. So I think, we've got to really address that trust gap. And I think it really starts with accountability and transparency and having a dialogue about these issues in communities with law enforcement and communities of color.
And I want to have time to talk about the question of allyship, because I think it's a very important question and it's part of the panel. Chiraag, did you want to touch briefly on the restoration of voting rights?
Sure, yeah, but there's a question in the chat from Andy Kang about, have you heard of any efforts in DC to restore the franchise to most incarcerated individuals? And the answer is yes. So in DC in particular, there is a very strong push to end felony disenfranchisement. The entire city council is on record as supporting a bill that is currently pending that would end felony disenfranchisement for people convicted of felonies in DC. Just recently, in an emergency bill that went through, the city ended that form of disenfranchisement for people who are held at the DC jail. So if you're held, that is somebody who has been convicted of a felony, is in custody. So this is post-conviction, before conviction, this is post-conviction. But if you're in custody at the DC jail because you're on appeal, so you're stayed within the jurisdiction instead of being sent out to a prison outside of DC, sometimes quite far away, which is where most people from the district serve their time, then you actually have the right. You will have the right to vote. Because of this provision that just went through. More broadly, my organization, Demos, is working on a push to get Congress to enfranchise people who are currently incarcerated on felony convictions through their legislative authority. This is a controversial area. Most of the efforts have been around rights restoration. That is, once you've probably heard, once you've paid your debt to society, once you've done your time, then you should get your right to vote back. I firmly believe, and my organization firmly believes, that you should never lose your right to vote in connection with the criminal legal system. I think voting is such a core part of personhood and citizenship. You shouldn't be able to lose it, especially given the various ways that our legal system is shot through with racial disparities. I just don't think it's defensible. And so the legal way that we would do this is relying on the enforcement clauses of the 14th and 15th Amendments. The question actually asks about the enforcement clause of the 13th Amendment as a badge or incident of slavery. I think that's it's worth exploring that as well. Right now, there's a part of H.R. 1. H.R. 1 is the big democracy bill that Congress prioritized in this Congress. In 2019, it passed. There's a part of it called the Democracy Restoration Act. It would automatically restore the right to vote in federal elections for anyone who has a felony conviction but is done with incarceration. So the argument I'm suggesting is if Congress has the power to do that, they also have the power to enfranchise people who are not done with incarceration, who are still within prison, and that we may well see better outcomes and responsiveness to the experiences of people who are incarcerated if they have political power in that way.
And just 15 seconds, I was going to say too, I think we also have to have a larger conversation in America about collateral consequences as a whole. Why is it that we continue to punish people who paid their debt to society? Why is it that when people come out, they're unable to get a business license? They have to check that box on the employment application. They're unable to vote. All of these collateral consequences that have nothing to do with the actual crime. For people who've already paid their debt to society, one could argue, at least from a public safety point of view, that when people come out of prison and they don't have hope, they're not able to get a job, they lose their place of housing because of their prior conviction, these hopeless people oftentimes commit more crimes. And so even if you just come from it from a conservative point of view, that you care about public safety, the larger sense of collateral consequences really makes no sense. And I think this is another opportunity for us to really revisit that concept.
So I want to move the conversation now to the question of allyship. This panel is organized by the Asian Pacific American Bar Association of DC, and we put out a statement in support of Black Lives Matter in solidarity with the Black community, against racism and injustice. I know that our national organization, NAACP, did as well. And, and even just as a resident of DC, I've gone out, into the streets and I've seen the kinds of people that you see protesting. It's a very diverse group of people. And we see all sorts of signs: white silence is white violence, as we saw. And then also I've seen like LGBT for Black Lives Matter, women for Black Lives Matter, Latinos for Black Lives Matter. A lot of groups, not just white people, but also, non-white, non-Black minorities, other racial minorities in the country, have also looked inwards. And I know that within the Asian American community, I've had conversations with fellow Asian Americans talking about, well, what does, we should talk about anti-Black racism within our community. And we address this as well in our statement from APABA-DC, talking about fighting anti-Black racism, not only sort of this general sense of anti-Black racism, but also anti-Black racism within ourselves and within our own communities. And so I'm interested to know what you all think. I mean, it's a big question, but I want to throw it out to the panel. What does it mean to be an ally? What can allies do? I know that a lot of people are, out in the streets and they're protesting, and people are buying books. You can see that, the bestseller books are now having to do with anti-racism, anti-racist baby, white supremacy. But beyond that sort of introspection, and I'm sure the introspection is important as well, but, what does it mean to be an ally, and what can allies do? Particularly, I think a lot of the audience is probably APA attorneys. Also, I know that we have others on the line as well. But I think people are interested in this question of, what can we do?
I'll say at the very beginning, I think allyship is just critically important, first of all. And let me just say, historically, every major social movement that has occurred in this country that has been really fomenting social change has had allies, right? I mean, you go back and you look at from Shays' Rebellion all the way to abolitionists. You go more recently, you think about Freedom Summer during the Civil Rights Movement, where students came from all over the country, many of them who were white. To really support African-American voting rights in Mississippi. And so at every turn of the ledger, we've always seen this notion of kind of allyship, and it's incredibly important. because I think what makes America so different is that America is not defined by one ethnicity, it's defined by values. And the promises of America, the promises of equality and due process and fairness, the things that we believe in our charting documents, it is an ongoing process to make America more perfect. And that impacts all of us. And when you look at various experiences from Native Americans and their treatment to the Asian community, I think about what they experienced during World War II, being put in internment camps, which, by the way, Korematsu, the Supreme Court case, has never been overruled, right, of that travesty. And so I think, as King said, look, what happens to one happens to all, right? This sense of the slippery slope of justice. And so I think it's really important for all of us to understand the importance of it and then to be very active.
And there's a lot of things that people can do in this moment. Don, you mentioned, you can go to protests, you can engage in what's happening right now. But, one thing, going back to the policy discussion, is that you can express your support for policy prescriptions that you believe that should be taken in this moment. And, again, that matters, right? It matters, to hear for your elected officials or government officials to hear from, from all constituents about what matters. It matters that people, to the Chiraag's point, that, budgets are moral documents. What we choose to invest our resources in also speaks to what we think is important. And again, I think it's so critically important, right, for this, the power of allyship. And it's not just true for the Black community now. I think it's true for any community that's, at a state of disadvantage, is that it sends the message that this matters to a broader range of people. And I think that is critically important to make clear in this moment that, this isn't about just appeasing a segment of the population, but that there is a critical mass of people who are demanding more. And then the last thing I will just say at this point, obviously, I think taking steps to educate yourself about, the experience of racism in this country is important. And, it's also, I think if you do that work, I think one thing that's clear is that kind of struggles of oppression in this country are, kind of fundamentally interconnected. And so many of them, really do thrive out of the African American experience and the experience of racism, just because it really has been our country's kind of original sin. And so, whether you're talking about women's rights, gender equality, LGBTQ rights, disability, if you run the gamut, it's hard not to kind of look at those stories without at least the backdrop of understanding the role of race and racism. And the very last thing I'll say is that I think in this moment too, one thing that we all can do in both big and small ways is, again, to my earlier point, that part of what I think is coming out of the protest is a lack of being heard and seen, by government and by society. And I think one thing we all can do is think about how do we legitimate and empower voices of people of color, other marginalized voices, and make sure that in our own positions of influence and power, we are making sure that we are leaving space for them to have a meaningful seat at the table in those discussions.
Mm-hmm. Sean, I know you've been working with activists in Fairfax County, and I know that like you said, you've had outreach from groups that you've probably, you've never heard of from before. People are really interested in helping. I'm wondering if you could talk about, maybe like a helpful ally and a well-meaning, but maybe not as helpful ally.
Yeah, I've definitely experienced that. So I think it's great that there's so much energy and engagement now, but I think I always caution people, like, listen to the people on the ground who've already been doing the work. Because I've seen people who are moved to do this and then they go out and they're asking for things that we already have, right? Like there's the 8 can't wait. So I've seen people push for that locally, and many of those things we already have in our police department, right? So you're almost giving them an easy out by saying, okay, yeah, we'll do that. And they're already doing it, right? I also think that people need to educate themselves and listen to the people doing this work because, for instance, we talk about taking the SROs out of schools. And the people on this line seem to all be in agreement with that because the data is so strong about that. But to the average parent who's never engaged in this thing, to hear that, they're like, wait, no, I don't know about that. They're not speaking from a place of knowledge. They're not speaking from like anything. It's just, I feel this way. So I think if you want to be an ally, you want to, I think you have to let the people who have been doing this work lead in a little bit. I think you have to help bolster their voices and not try to replace their voices or substitute them or speak over them. And then I think you also need to be open-minded, because there are things that are happening, and what this really is born out of when we talk about policing is that as a Black individual, your lived experience and your experience with police may be vastly different than white people, right? So some of the solutions that we are putting forth, they may sound radical to you because you don't realize that that's even a problem. And so we have to make sure that we are actually being allies and being helpful to the people who are advocating on the ground.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's a really powerful point. I mean, look, I think all of us on this panel could tell you personal stories of how we've been impacted. And you have some very impressive, well-educated people on this panel. I mean, I can speak for myself. I don't even drive a car, in part because of the number of times that I was pulled over and the treatment that you said, the indignation of that experience, right? And so, and all of us on this panel could really kind of tell those stories. And so I think part of being an ally too, I think is, confirming narratives, being able to have that sense of empathy for people whose plight may look very different than yours, whose ordinary experience may look very different than yours. But I think it also needs to be really confirmed as part of reality.
I just want to add one other thing. And it occurs to me because we're in this group where, Asians sometimes are looked at as the model minority, right? And don't allow yourself to be put in that bucket. Don't allow them to pit us against each other. And to do that, I think that's a powerful thing too, because I've seen that happen. And I think that's an important aspect of what's going on here, is that we have to make sure in our own spaces and identities that we're not allowing this sort of anti-Black racism to occur.
Mm-hmm. Both Johnathan and Chiraag have worked in a sense as allies. Johnathan worked at the Muslim Advocates, and Chiraag has been doing a lot of work in this, for racial equality and against anti-Black racism. And I'm wondering if both of you can talk a little bit about your work in that space.
Johnathan, you want to go first?
Sure. Well, I will say, so after I left the Obama administration and working with Chiraag, I had the opportunity to serve as the legal director at Muslim Advocates, and I joined that organization right as President Trump was enacting the first version of his infamous Muslim ban. And one of the things that was really interesting about my experience with that organization was the fact that I had to think a lot about allyship myself as someone who's not Muslim and coming into a community that certainly I thought I knew something about because I took the job, but also had to recognize that there was a lot that I didn't know. And to the point that Cho was making, one of the things that I hope I did somewhat effectively, or at least didn't mess up too much, was also to recognize that in that moment of the Muslim ban was very much in the headlines, a lot of Muslim communities were, I think, feeling very similar to, I think, or could, I think, empathize with a lot of feelings that Black communities are feeling now, where they felt in some ways just totally illegitimized by their government. And one of the things that was really important in that moment was to counter that feeling, and working for an organization representing American Muslim communities, but not being Muslim myself, thinking about the role I played in that issue and that effort. And the last thing I would say too, when I started at Muslim Advocates, I had some trepidation because I had spent a lot of time both in the Obama administration, but before that, working on issues of racial justice. And one of my concerns was that I was going into this community, into this organization where a lot of the issues we were working on were issues, obviously, of religious discrimination and bigotry. But one of the things I realized, very quickly in my role there was that, by many accounts, the largest plurality of the American Muslim community are Black Muslims. And so that some of the issues that I thought were foreign or different or not relevant to that community, in fact, were very much relevant, obviously with different wrinkles and complexities. But in the same point that I think part of the thought, part of being a good ally is going, listening, and learning. I think one of the things you get from that is I think you realize that there are ways that your own experience or set of experiences may resonate and connect to those communities if you kind of open yourself up to recognizing that there's more that you can learn about what you're doing and who you're engaging with.
Yeah, certainly, and I will say, just speaking from the APABA-DC's perspective, you know, the George Floyd murder happened basically very soon after we issued our own statement against COVID racism and xenophobia, and it was an effort by our board to bring light to that situation, to anti-Asian attacks, but then also we galvanized the minority or the diverse bar in the DC area. We ended up getting 20 bar associations involved on our statement. And we thought after that, I mean, we were horrified by what we saw, in the George Floyd video and the Ahmaud Arbery video and everything. But there was also a sense of, where Asian Americans are is a direct result of Black freedom struggles, and also in the micro context, the Washington Bar Association, GWAC, all these other organizations stood with us when we were talking about anti-Asian racism. We have to stand also, with the Black community in this movement as well. Chiraag, I don't know if you wanted to add on anything. I can go to the next one.
Sure. Yeah. No, I'll just talk about this question of allyship. I'm just going to hit a couple of. It's going to resonate with some of the points that you all have made. So I appreciate you going first on this. When I think about allyship, I'm thinking back to 20 years ago when I was in college and what I probably thought allyship was. When I was in college, I was very into seeing similarities across the different racial groups. I was really into, pan-ethnic activism and this sort of allyship. And I think seeing similarities and connections is important, but glossing over them and glossing over differences and ignoring distinctions in an attempt to build solidarity is really a dangerous path and can reinforce anti-Blackness and white supremacy, because you don't really get to the root of the problem. And I think, so what does allyship look like to me today? I think it looks like centering anti-Blackness as the problem. A number of people have used that term here. And, I've recently read an op-ed by Dr. Kiana Mariah Ross of Northwestern. I recommend it to anyone if you or Google anti-Blackness and the New York Times, you'll see her op-ed. And in there, she describes what is anti-Blackness, and she describes it very simply as society's inability to recognize Black humanity. And I think that it really does encapsulate it when I think about, it stems from slavery. It's continued through the different systems of control that Roscoe talked about. And I mean, anti-Blackness is how you get an allegation about a $20 bill being counterfeit, turning into an officer, arresting, and then kneeling on the neck of George Floyd for almost 9 minutes. A situation that didn't even call for a law enforcement response, really, certainly not an arrest. It's how you get, 3 white men hunting down and killing Ahmaud Arbery in Georgia, in one of the other cases you mentioned, Don, pegging him as a criminal because he ran through their white neighborhood on his jog. And so many other situations I think can be explained by that. I think we really do need to talk about anti-Blackness and not just racism. We need to center Black people and not just people of color, right? The phrase people of color is important, but it also has a way of eliding the Black people and Black leadership. I think we can just center Black leadership. I think that's another form of allyship that's really important. Certainly something I think about a lot. Because I was in the Obama administration, like a number of us were, I get asked to speak on policing because of some of the work that I did. And I do some of that, but I don't do all of it. And I think pretty critically about it because there's a way in which, I'm being designated as an expert. And who are the experts? It's the people who have more direct experience with police and the people who are at the vanguard of the movement for Black lives. So I don't want to displace them. I don't want to be used as a tool against them. And I think what we can do, for Asian American folks who are sitting on this call and thinking about it is really don't accept the benefits of anti-Black racism. This is to Sean's point, right, about model minorities. And I think that Asian Americans have been slotted into a racial hierarchy in the United States and used to kind of prop up white supremacy and further define Blackness as bad, evil, inferior. And we have accepted the benefits in major ways. I think it's funny because it's a core technology. Racism, the technology of racism that stems from anti-Blackness is also used against Asian and Asian American people. But we do accept the benefits. And I would offer, for example, if you're supporting the affirmative action case against Harvard as an Asian American, you're not a good ally. That's not allyship. That is a specific strategy that is meant to destroy gains that were won by the Black freedom struggle and Black activism over years. And there are other examples like that. So I think the work is really confronting, how am I benefiting from this work? What can I do differently? How do I confront anti-Blackness and racism, structural racism in my community and in the workplace, in the social structures that I'm a part of? Start looking for it, identifying it, and it's going to be uncomfortable, but state it, raise it in conversation, in polite conversation. That's a small price to pay, I think, for the goal here of allyship that we're discussing.
Yeah, and this was a question an audience member too about, because we've talked about the macro level of policy changes and also the Metse level in terms of local and state. But there's also a question about the micro level, and Chiraag just brought that up in terms of in each individual action in their own, at this point, quarantine bubble or whatever, but in your own community, in your own family, and the audience member asks if there's any suggestions on how to address unconscious bias, implicit bias. I think Chiraag had some great suggestions. I'd be interested to hear of what others think people can do at that kind of really individual micro level.
Yeah, look, I'll answer that question. I mean, look, I think that question also mentions, is racism really a generational issue, right? Which I think is a very deep concept. And I think sometimes we have this myth of progress, that just because time passes, we have progressed and we are smarter than generations that have come before us. It's not lost on me that Dylan Roof, the individual who went into Mother Emanuel Church, an African-American church in South Carolina, murdered 9 African-Americans, was 21 years old. It's not lost on me that the individual back in 2014, June 2014 in Mississippi, who literally ran an African-American homeless person down with a truck, an egregious hate crime, was 19 years old. And all these individuals were radicalized by this ideology of racial indifference. And that racial indifference, as Chiraag was mentioning, has been specific to African Americans since the beginning of this country. But look, we were told by the Constitution that we were 3/5 of a person. We were told by the Supreme Court in Dred Scott that we have no rights that a white man is bound to respect. By the U.S. Supreme Court, we were hung from trees, where people would bring thousands of folks, including their families, their kids, to watch this, to take pictures, and to leave with souvenirs. And we were then taken on a sense of American apartheid and separated from American society. So you can't have that type of history and then not understand the racial indifference when African Americans are shot and killed. I mean, you saw it in a police officer's face in Minnesota. How do you do that for 8 minutes and 46 seconds and be completely indifferent to the life of another, right? I think it's an incredibly deep point. And so I think, the last thing I'll just say is that, look, I think everyone, when you think about allyship, everyone should read Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail. It is as relevant today as it was before. His letter was not about the racists. His letter was really about the folks that were supposedly so-called allies. It was a message to liberals, right, about being indifferent to the suffering of others, particularly indifferent to the suffering of African Americans. And I think this notion of racial difference is important, but it's also incredibly important to note this notion of being completely indifferent to the injustices that we see in our society and not speaking up.
Mm-hmm. Do any of you want to speak to any within families, how do you talk about, or at your micro level, like if you're talking with people within your workplace, people, among your friends, what does it look like to be an ally in those small situations, in those kind of micro situations?
I've gotten this question a lot lately too, and I struggle with it because, at the end of the day, you're not really risking your safety or anything like that. You're risking your discomfort, right? You're inconvenienced at most. I mean, maybe it makes for an awkward situation with someone you have to see again, but for the most part, you're just uncomfortable with. And I think we have to realize there are people who, because of the ideas that you are letting exist and perpetuate and go on unchecked, they are in risk of their safety and everything else. This is holding them back in a fundamental way. So I think you have to have the conversation. You have to be educated on it, and you have to push back in those spaces. I think that's the best way to be an ally. To simply say, be silent, and then kind of think to yourself, well, that wasn't very nice. It doesn't do anything. So I think if we're talking about fundamental cultural change, we each have to do our part in that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think it really is just a matter of comfort. That comfort that you're describing, Sean, is also a product of, I think, white supremacy and the system that allows us as non-Black people who don't suffer from anti-Blackness, but benefit from it in some ways, to continue enjoying the benefits of that, because we're going to have to be the ones to raise it. So I think, by stepping into that discomfort, you're not, that's a way to take the burden off of your Black friends and colleagues and community members to constantly be the ones talking about racism, right? And explaining it. People right now, everyone's looking to their Black friends like, hey, can you talk to me? I mean, look, step up, step into it, have these hard conversations. My experience is that actually everybody desperately wants to talk about race, and some people don't know how to do it, but they really want to have the conversation. So I think approach that with a spirit of generosity. And, I have some opinions that I've shared here, but I don't think I know all this stuff. I don't have it all right. And I benefit from conversations with my friends and my family. The family stuff, honestly, is a lot harder. Just to be, or perhaps that's my own experience, but, you're dealing with really ingrained racism, and often there's a transnational valence to it, right? And there's a different forms of racism or discrimination coupled with colonialism that have been sort of baked into the mindset that you may be confronting. I think that's quite difficult. But I think starting to talk about that, I've made the mistake of trying to beat racism out of my family instead of examining it in myself and then having a conversation about it. I think that's not the way to go. So I would say don't do it that way, but just approach it and see, have the conversation. I agree it's uncomfortable, but it'll never get more comfortable if we don't try.
Yeah. And I think that, that introspection, Chiraag, that you're talking about, looking within yourself first, because it's easy to be like, to say, well, that's racist or, whatever. But then to think about, how we as Asian Americans or anybody in the audience, white or LGBT or whatever, how you benefited from anti-Black racism, I think that is sort of the first step, right? And going on that journey of introspection, not by asking your friends to do the work for you, your Black friends to do your work for you and say, well, what should I read? What should I look at? Everybody can very easily diversify their own Instagram, Twitter feeds. There's lots of suggestions on the internet for really great Black thinkers and writers to follow on social media. There's lots of great books that are out, that have been out. People have been writing about this for a very long time. It's not like the anti-racist movement just started, with the murder of George Floyd. There have been lots of things that have been written, lots of movements that have, happened before that we've talked about, that people can learn about. And I think that introspection is sort of a first step, right? And then all the things that we've been talking about, micro level, metse level, macro level, all of that's important. We're getting close to our time, so I want to open the floor to our panelists and just see if anybody has anything else that you want to say. or if not, I see that we're 45 seconds before the end. I'm just going to look through the comments to see if there's any other questions.
Someone asked me a very specific question about the local school system. I don't have time to get into it, but I would say that we do not have an racist school system. Connect with me on LinkedIn or somewhere else, and I'll be happy to tell you about it. But there's serious problems there. Anyway, thank you for having me, though.
Yes.
I'll just add as closing thoughts. Look, I think, thank you so much for convening this conversation. I think that this is an overdue conversation. I'm glad that lawyers are starting to really engage. Look, personally, I think for our generation, the same way that previous generations, my father marched at Bloody Sunday at Selma. He was one of the co-organizers of Freedom Summer '64. The way that our generation before fought for civil rights against Jim Crow, I believe that the challenge of this generation, the moral challenge of this generation, is really dealing with mass incarceration and all of its tentacles, from police reform, bail reform, the amount of people we have behind bars, prison labor, you name it. It's a system that literally not only deprives people of liberty, but when they come out, it deprives them of rights. And so I encourage all of you to educate yourselves about the mass incarceration system and be active. Be active and really trying to dismantle it, because I really believe it's a challenge of our generation.
Great. Well, with that, I just want to say thank you from APABA-DC and from all of the panel members, for all of our audience members. Thank you to NAACP for sponsoring, and also to Wiley and to Quinn Emanuel for sponsoring as well. I know that I've really enjoyed this conversation and loved talking with you all. I hope that you all have found this conversation to be interesting and enlightening. And I hope just the beginning of the conversation, one of the things that APABA-DC committed to in our statement against supporting the Black Lives Matter movement and in solidarity with the Black community against racism, we really committed to looking within ourselves and looking, committing to combat racism, both societally and within our own community, and then also continuing not just with words, but with actions as well. This panel was a first start to have a conversation, to talk within our community and with allies, and we'd love to continue this conversation. For any of you on the line that have an idea about a subsequent conversation that you think we should have, we would love to hear those ideas. You can always reach us. You can reach me at president@apaba-dc.org. You can email me and ask me or suggest any kinds of programs that you think we ought to have, anything you'd like to see, and we hope that this is just the start of the conversation and further actions. So thank you again to our panelists. I really appreciate your time tonight and to agreeing to be on the panel, and I hope everyone has a good night. So thank you.
Thanks.